So my name is Nat Warren, and I'm very lucky to have been asked to take care of you for the next 2 hours and to make sure that some of our speakers stick to time and that and sort of chair the session. So we've got some great speakers that will talk to you for short periods of time, and then what we're looking for is lots of interaction. So the panel speakers will come to the front. You can fire questions at them. You can disagree with them. You can raise your own points and so on. And hopefully by the end of the session, we'll have got somewhere. So this is what we're calling the Giants Workshop. And it really is just following on from Isaac Newton's words, or words to this effect, which is all about seeing further because of standing on the shoulders of giants. So the workshop, I should tell you, is being live streamed to the world, no, not to the world. It's been live streamed to all of those wonderful ISES members who are part of that private members page, who unfortunately couldn't be here today but desperately want to be, and so hopefully they're listening in. So I'm sure all of you would say a massive hello to all of our other ISES family members. The other thing that we should also note is that my colleague Paul suggested that actually this was a great opportunity for us to try and capture some themes and some ideas and see what comes out of the 2 hours of our workshop. So we're very fortunate to have the lovely Rachel, who has come here. She's a psychologist, I think, by training, and she's offered up some of her time to try to capture some themes and ideas and put together a sort of mind map for us that will feed into some of the work that my Colleen and Alicia over there are also doing, which again will be trying to look at some of the common themes from an equitation science point of view, and we'll use all of this hopefully to provide you with some ideas of some of the things that were coming up more frequently by the end of this conference, but we'll also put it together in a sort of piece that can go up on the Equitation Science website if you say sensible things, actually. If you don't, we won't. So if you can just bear in mind that we are being live streamed, so although everything that is said will be said within the confines of our Equitation Science family, obviously just as we go into this and you get a little bit heated, if you could just remember that others can listen in and might not always get the context. So, she says very tactfully. So really just to remind you the reason why we're having this 2-hour session, and that is because most of us here, in fact all of us here at some point have stood on the shoulders of some giants, giants in our fields, perhaps people who you've personally known, people who are still with us and people who've passed. And certainly equitation science has come an awfully long way. Has come an awfully long way in a very, very short time. And you heard from Hayley earlier about the kind of history of how it all started and the sorts of amazing things that have happened along the way, and the body of work really that has happened as a result, I think, of being able to bring together people who can discuss their ideas in a space that is specifically about equitation science. So that's fantastic and great. However, we also recognise that we've got a long, long way to go if we're going to challenge practices and thinking, human attitudes and acceptance. And in order to do that, we need to be able to produce more evidence, because although we can look at this and say this is not acceptable, there are many others who think it's perfectly acceptable. And even recently, I have to say, in the UK, we saw MPs, as they're voting out all of the things to do with Brexit and all of the common European directives, we also saw them deny the fact that animals are sentient in a piece of legislation that is no longer now in the UK or enshrined in UK law. Hopefully they realise that that's not the way things need to be, but at the moment, as it stands, people are quite shocked by the backward step they see this has taken. So there are some very good reasons for looking back. I know a lot of people say don't look back, but looking back is quite helpful. And we know that success leaves tracks. So we can learn an awful lot from the knowledge of what went before, and may well have been forgotten. And some of the things that our amazing speakers are going to talk about, I'm sure, are things that they have read about and that they recognise and perhaps have been lost, and perhaps the sorts of things that we should revisit. But looking back also, as you know, history always helps us because it helps us to avoid making the same mistakes. And so we can learn a lot from the work that others have done and the mistakes that they made. I think it's also useful for us to have the chance to look back at the practice and the research findings of before, and perhaps just view them through a more modern lens. Because there's an awful lot of things that didn't work before, but perhaps with our new technology can work now and can be quite useful as we move forward. And of course, I think the main thing in looking back is to be able to have a better understanding of where the practices, where these things that we do with horses actually came from. If we understand them and how they have been adopted, we perhaps can then start to challenge them more effectively. So there are an awful lot of early influences, and you're going to hear about some of those. You'll hear about some of the modern influences as well. But it's important, really, I think, to recognise that people like Xenophon, who wrote supposedly the first manuscript on horsemanship, had some really important things to say. I have to say he also said some pretty shocking things as well. He was a man of his time. But I think some of these things still stand for us today. The sweetest of all sounds is praise. And whatever a horse is forced to do, it will do without understanding and beauty, just like a dancer who gets abused would dance without grace. So that was quite an important thing to say. And as you read through the translation of his horsemanship book, you start to see things that actually are kind of, you recognise, have guided a lot of the traditional ways that we manage and train horses today. Horses should associate being alone with thirst and hunger and the presence of man with things pleasurable, which is quite interesting. It might not feel that comfortable to us, but in some respects that is part of what we do when we manage horses. Rewarded with kindness for doing something right and trained to associate certain words with appropriate responses. That seems to resonate with us. Broken for riding at two, using a bit with keys to encourage salivation. That's still a practice today for some. And saddling done from the left side. So you can see where all that comes from. Light bit pressure, only effective when not always present. So there's an awful lot of things that in the Xenophon philosophy that I think looking back at, we can start to recognise where some of our practices have come from. And there's still, I won't go into some of the horrible things that are in his manuscript, but there's an awful lot in there that isn't particularly good or useful. So you can kind of cherry pick some of the things. So without further ado, the objectives of this next session are to hear about some of the key contributions of early influences and to understand the significance of their work, to explore some of the possibilities that arise from looking back at what can be learned and how that might be applied in future equitation science work, and to capture, because of our amazing team, some of the main discussion themes to help guide new thinking, inspire new initiatives, and potentially provide new directions for equitation science. So we'll just have to see what comes out of it. I'd like to thank the 5 equitation scientists present here who have all agreed, without too much arm twisting, to present to you. They'll come up individually in this order, because I've had a little peek at your talks, so I think this is the way it will work best. And afterwards they'll come and sit up here and we'll be able to have that discussion. So we did actually ask a few of our honorary fellows who have not been able to be present, and they all send their goodwill to us. They would like to remind us of a lot of the early practitioners who've also lent quite a lot to the field of equitation science without recognising it. But I'm sure that these will come up as we go along. So if I could like to invite Andrew up. And where's my trusty technology queen? So,
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd just like to take you through probably one of my greater moments of epiphany in my life that led me to want to choose to talk about the behaviourists today. And that is many years ago. I was teaching a girl in my arena, and she brought a horse that was very tense and difficult. And I was telling her, and being a zoologist in my background, I was telling her that she needed to understand the social hierarchy of horses, and therefore she needed to make the horse respect her. He was walking all over her and difficult under saddle. And bear in mind, I knew no learning theory at that time. In zoology, we only ever learned ethology. And Paul is going to talk about some elements of that, I think. But however, so without denigrating ethologists too much, I found that in my background it didn't really give me a whole lot of insight into understanding training. But I didn't know that at that time. So I was telling her about these things that she faced and that she needed to make the horse respect her, and that would solve everything. And her father was listening to me as he was apparently reading a newspaper with the window wound down of his car. And it was probably even upside down. He was really busy listening to what I had to say. And he came up to me and he said, "So you're telling me that my daughter's horse is dominant?" And I said, "Yes, it walks all over her." And he said, "You're a zoologist, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I'm very proud of that. Not just a horse trainer." And he said, "Well, you zoologists are all alike." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I'm surprised you're not telling my daughter that the mistakes the horse is making are just mistakes in single learned responses." And I dropped dead because I was about to take money from this man for his daughter's lesson, and I suddenly felt I probably should give him some. And I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Professor Kim Eng. I'm Professor of Experimental Psychology at Monash University." And there was another major pausing moment. And I said, "I think I could use you. I just started my PhD." And he said, "You've just started your PhD, haven't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, who are your supervisors?" And I told him, and I was very proud of them too, and I still am. And he said, "But they're ethologists. You need someone to do with learning theory, surely." And I said, "Yes, would you like to be involved?" And he said, "Yes, I would." And that really led me down this path, a whole new path that we zoologists, and also true for certainly veterinary education at that time, were not exposed to. So this is what I want to talk about today, is about the behaviourists. And also the challenges they face, and one of the reasons why we don't necessarily think of it in the glowing terms that we probably should, and one of the problems that happened where we didn't continue on with their work for many years, and it's only recently been dug up again. So the first one, if I can make this machine work, is Thorndike. Now Thorndike, many of you would know about Thorndike. He proposed the law of effect, that behaviours that have favourable consequences for organisms will occur more frequently because they'll be learned, and those with less will occur less frequently. He also made an interesting observation that when animals learn things, they tend not to show aha moments like people do. They tend to need to trial responses, and we see that even when we use appetitive reinforcers like food, it takes a while for the horse to do it. They basically shut down the degree of errors before they get it error-free. And then John Watson. Now John Watson was an important one as well. Oops. He, where are we? There he is. He attacked contemporary psychology of the day and found it far too fluffy. And he also believed that animals provided great insight. So he really pushed forward with the idea of doing experiments on animals, because you could control all the variables which we are unable to do with humans in most good welfare human situations. So he proposed a purely objective experimental science, and his goal was to be able to predict and control behaviour. So he was one of Skinner's great mentors. And finally, I'm unable to go past Hull either. Hull was really important to me in my early life in understanding behaviour, because basically when you read Hull, it's really dry, and he put forward so much behaviour in mathematical terms, but when you really think about it, it made enormous sense. In fact, how we use overshadowing and how we understand it as a desensitisation technique came from my reading of Hull, and it was pretty much up until that moment I found it really tedious and wished I hadn't bothered to read it. He explained motivation as an increase in tension in animals, and that therefore, in terms of drive theory, we need to fulfil these drives, and when we fulfil these drives, then the tension would be reduced. And finally, the most outstanding, or perhaps the most remembered, and certainly the most influential of them all, was B.F. Skinner. And he basically proposed the ideas encapsulated in operant conditioning, whereby animals and people operate on their environment to produce various rewards and consequences. And he talked about behaviour as being not a product of thought, but really a product of reinforcement, that behaviours get reinforced. And this was a major step forward. We use the term sometimes in academic areas, such as the operant contingency, but in lay terms we can call this the ABCs, where we have a cue, there's a certain behaviour that we target, and when the animal gives, we can use various ways of motivating the animal to produce that behaviour, and then we reward the behaviour. So that's the consequences, the reinforcement. So this was all good and well leading up until the end of the 1960s, and his work was highly promoted. He wrote over 400 papers, and he contributed greatly to American education for children. He had a lot to say. He said we could do far better than we do, because children are basically put into a factory and taught, and reinforcement isn't really used, and we don't vary the reinforcement. It's like gold star if you're good and nothing, or the strap if you're bad. But there's not much variation of positive reinforcement, and he really proposed that we could do much better. However, there were problems, because behaviourism wasn't going to last. In the 1960s, there were all sorts of other issues going on, and people lost their faith in science. I can remember my mother told me that when she would go down the street in Melbourne in the 1950s and 60s, she could get her foot x-rayed to get shoes that had the perfect fit. And she never thought there was a problem with x-rays then, because if you're allowed to do it, it seems like a really good idea, and technology is just fantastic. But the wheels fell off that idea. In the military, we had fears of nuclear mass destruction, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that started to make people quite sceptical about what these white-coated lab people had in mind. In medicine, we had some serious medical mishaps, such as the thalidomide tragedy. In the environment, DDT was sprayed everywhere, all around in Queensland, in most tropical places, in South Africa, to get rid of mosquitoes. And it was wonderful, because there were no more mosquitoes and no more anything really that flew about. And Rachel Carson came along and wrote her book Silent Spring, and showed that this was a huge mistake, and this DDT continued right up the food chain and was causing major destruction of ecosystems. And at the same time, contrary to what Skinner was doing, there were other researchers who were showing that there are other things other than reinforcement that are really important. In fact, some of them thought it was more important than reinforcement as well. And in fact, some of it is. And what they showed, particularly in the beginning, Harry Harlow showed that with his work on rhesus monkeys, that love was a really important thing, and we couldn't really define it. I actually don't think Harlow was a really good scientist, because I think he could have a little bit. Because what he did with his experiments, he had a rhesus monkey clutching a mother that was cold, or another one that was made of wire, and another one that kicked its baby across the room as soon as she clutched it. All the horrible aspects of awful motherhood. And showed that, you know, the most important thing to the baby was the love of its mother and that mother-infant bond, and it led to our modern understanding of attachment theory. And Bowlby also went further with that in his work. And this led to the cognitive revolution. Now, at the very same time, in America, the social conservatives were very concerned about Skinner, because he and Watson were both making these outrageous claims. They were saying, for example, that you could train a peasant to be a lawyer. You might even give black people and maybe even women a job. And so it was rocking the status quo. And so naturally, the social conservatives really clamped down on this, and Skinner was really maligned after that. And Skinner lost his job, his students didn't get jobs. There were no papers after 1968 that had the word operant conditioning in those papers, and yet there were a flurry of them up until 1968. So behaviourism was dead, and it was replaced by the cognitive revolution, where it was again, certainly in John Watson's view and Clark Hull's and Skinner's words, it would have been, it was a much more fluffy approach. It was much more subjective. And so this very objective approach to understanding animals lost, and it was really only continued to be used by teachers who trained children that had behaviour problems or disabilities, and by circus trainers and in ocean area and places like that, and zoos, who knew very well how well the technology, as Skinner called it, of behaviour worked. And so this was the problem, and this is why throughout the 70s and 80s, many psychologists who were trained in that era automatically reject behaviourism. But the pendulum has swung back, and behaviour therapy is now one of the few therapies that you can claim in this country. You can claim rebates on our National Health Service because it is so effective. And so whilst we don't want to throw out what we already had, our tendency with humans is always to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, and we should have really embraced behaviourism and just continued on with subjective pursuit, because we would know a whole lot more about training. And that's really where we are in equitation science. I think now we have this great opportunity to look at all inputs from mythology, from the cognitive revolution as well, because that produced some interesting results in attachment theory and all of those things, and make things a whole lot better. But for me, the cornerstone is learning theory. So thank you.
So now we have the lovely Paul McGreevy,
Thanks, Nat. The lovely Paul McGreevy isn't feeling very lovely, I'm afraid. I've got man flu. It's awful. But I'm really pleased to be here. The prospect of standing on giant shoulders for a dwarf like me is very exciting. And an opportunity to reflect on the people who inspired me to take the journey I've taken. Of course, I agree with all of Andrew's remarks, but he and I colluded, as we often do. And I agreed to look at the ethologists first and foremost, and knowing that Andrew would do such a good job on the other fields. So my focus is going to be on these ethologists that started to gain the attention of the scientific community. Carl von Fritz, who studied honeybees, the honeybee dance, Konrad Lorenz, who focused on imprinting, and Nico von Tinbergen, who looked at who looked at the way animals begin to learn from each other, and how we been a real challenge to be taken seriously, but we're getting there. Some of us are publishing in high impact journals now, and who knows, there may be one day an equitation scientist who gets the Nobel Prize. There could be a student in the room who's just think of that, who could be doing that. The main thing that they taught us was to be very descriptive in the behaviours, not to interpret the behaviours, but to describe what we saw. And that is an incredibly important message. Only then can we start thinking about the cause of the behaviour, the function or the ontogeny, and the evolution. It's interesting that core message about describing what you see and not leaping into an interpretation keeps us honest, and it's also what I think led to one of the most important discoveries in associative learning, and that was through Pavlov. Because Pavlov was such a good scientist, he recorded everything that he saw, and he noted that the dogs that were in his studies would race ahead to leap onto the table because they'd get meat powder puffed into their faces. And you can see how much fun they had as having a rip-roaring time in that. But the point is that he recorded that the animals were placing themselves in a position to get a reward. And he was, first of all, he was a physiologist. He was interested in saliva because it was interrupting his gastric liquor studies. But the key message here was that because he kept a good notebook, he spotted that the animals were placing themselves in a position to get a reward. And so he hinted at the first form of operant conditioning. While he was studying that associated learning, he actually developed the first seed of a nugget of interest in operant conditioning. And the dogs were operating in an environment to get into a position where they could reward themselves. And you know, we are so lucky with the technology we have. If we get the cameras in the right positions, we can record all of the behaviour. We don't have to write everything down in note form. So if you've got an opportunity to capture data, grab it in honour of these people. And we are so lucky to have so much cheap technology, cost-effective, not cheap technology. Just imagine how much more fun these chaps would have had if they had iPhones. Now, a quick nod to the next giant on my landscape, Bernard Schumack. Elke, can you pronounce that more effectively for me? No, it's been Grismek in my mind for far too long. But what I liked about this guy's work just before and after the war was that he asked the animals how they interacted with very basic challenges and basic stimuli. So he made a 2D image of a horse and asked the horses how they would interact with it. I think we should do more of that. We could have, I've said before, we could have an ISES, this is a bit left field, an ISES inflatable horse that every lab could have. We could send it out, and then we could know the horses that were interacting with that standard stimulus were interacting with a single stimulus. That would allow us to start coalescing data from different laboratories and conduct what's called meta-analysis. But one of the other things he did was he looked at left and right handedness in horses and found remarkably similar results. We just published a paper that shows very similar results to what Grismek reported in 1968. So he was a bit of a hero, and he's often unrecognised. And Frank Berg asked that he was given a nod, so I'm happy to do that. I also want to acknowledge not just the ethologists, but the people who have spoken up for horses. Because even without a strong scientific base, they have seen what's going wrong for horses, and they've given them a voice. And you have to acknowledge the role of Anna Sewell in this. The wonderful thing about the frontispiece of her book, this is the frontispiece of Black Beauty, and if I'm criticised for being an advocate for horses, then so be I can sleep nights. And if science is one way to do that, that's good. The British Veterinary Association has said that it's a job, this year they've said it's the job of vets like me to advocate for animals. So quite a liberating world we're finding ourselves in despite Brexit. And included in that sort of these people who've spoken for horses and reminded us to think through their biology and their ethology, I'd like to include Henry Blake. So I grew up with these books, Horse Sense, Thinking of Horses and Talking of Horses. Very simply, just saying, if you want to get a horse to jump a fence, why not put another horse over the fence? Instead of dominating the horse and forcing it to oblige, think of it as a herd animal first of all. How healthy is that? And then Lucy Rees, who was honoured at the first Equitation Science Conference and presented there, has had a remarkable impact on this domain. So I'd like to thank Lucy and remark on her great work. She had a scientific training, but she hasn't necessarily published with p-values, but a lot of what she has to say is the stimulus that other people can pick up and run with. So hypotheses can be generated from authors like this. And in the same way, Mark Carter-Worthington has had the same effect. And so these three, Blake, Rees and Worthington, Carter-Worthington, I think have had an enormous role in the emergence of what we see today as equitation science. Not all of them are necessarily that easy to work with because Henry Blake is dead. But we've still got some great inspiration from these people, and I'm grateful. And then from the ethologists came the cognitive ethologists, people who dared to suggest that animals have minds. We're thinking here of Marion Stanford-Hawkins and her PhD student, Christine Nicol. And Marion was a PhD student of Nico Tinbergen. So you can see this line that's come through. And I was incredibly fortunate to be a PhD student of Christine Nicol. So I see these as my academic forebears. And it was, if you haven't read Marion's book, Through Our Eyes Only, then do yourself a favour. It's very important. It's a landmark piece that showed how fairly dry studies of animal behaviour and ethology can begin very slowly to reveal the minds within. So do yourself a favour, as Molly Meldrum used to say, and get hold of that one. I hope that's given due regard to these luminaries. I'm sure I've missed some out, and I apologise for that. And I'll look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And now we've got Jan, and your talk will be age 2 of you.
not to be confused with this Benhart. It's from Britain. The Benhart I'm going to talk about is from California. He's a distinguished professor. I don't know what that title means. Maybe you get a higher salary. At the University of California. Ben has contributed tremendously in many different areas. He was he's established a behavior clinic for companion animals, for dogs and cats, and it's still running today very successfully. And he's worked very extensively, not only in recording behavior problems in companion animals, but also finding solutions. He established the behavior graduate program at the vet school in Davis, and he is still alive and really with us. And is right now he's into especially interested in the cognition of elephants. You might be interested in that. His basic research was mostly in behavior physiology and analyzing the effect of various hormones, especially sexual hormones, on behavior. And that basic work he tried to apply to solving behavior problems. He's been very prolific in his writing. He has, I think, 180 research papers, but he's also written a lot of articles for lay people. So now I think he has something like 300 articles published. And he's published several books. Some of them are quite scientific. The behavior of domestic animals is one of them. But he's also published some very bestsellers, actually, for lay people. If you want to find out how to choose the right dog for your family, you should look at his book, The Perfect Puppy. And you can do it the same way if you want to buy a cat and take a cat into your home. He wrote a paper in 1988, the biological basis of the behavior of sick animals. And I think he was pretty much the first to look into the behavior of sick animals. And so he wrote a review paper on that. And it's what you would call in the scientific world, it's a bestseller. It has been cited in way over 1,000 later articles. In the paper, he shows how the symptoms that we see, such as fever and pain and anorexia and whatever, they all serve one common purpose for the animal, namely to survive. And when you think about the use of medicine to dampen fever when your child has an infection, for instance, or when veterinarians, especially more modern veterinarians, use painkiller medicine to dampen some reaction, you should give it an extra thought and think if that's the right approach to these conditions. In fact, this paper ought to be required reading for all veterinarians, and in fact, any person interested in animals should read that paper. It's very noteworthy. Wasn't that just on the screen? Oh, I'm sorry. This is because this screen is different. Anyway, there you can see some of the dog doesn't want to eat, gets fever, and it also induces sleep. It's a messenger transmitter in the organism that stimulates not only the had a science like that, it would be looking at how we implement things the best way. And I think that's a very important thing to think about. Bernhard did that not only did he do that in his behavior clinic, but he took it a step further, because it's not enough to introduce something, a new way of solving a problem or a new way to use, I don't know, special kind of equipment for writing purpose or whatever. It's easy to introduce things, and with a bit of hard work you can also maybe get some people to use whatever you're suggesting. But that's not enough. Now, if we look at what ISES is doing, is trying to get research over to lay people, and I think that's good. But I would suggest that we take that one step further and try to find out what impact does it have. And that thought I got from Bernhard, because he did just that. He had had a number of dogs in his clinic that were treated for various behavioral problems, such as aggression or roving or mounting or whatever. And the standard answer or solution to that problem that he used and that many veterinarians suggest to the dog owner is to get the dog castrated. But actually, nobody knows. Earlier, nobody knew what effect that had. So Bernhard hired a number of veterinary students and had them call the owners of these dogs that had been in this clinic about 6 months after they had been castrated. The dogs had been castrated, and to find out if the operation had actually changed the behavior. And if you look at the first column, it really has a big effect on dogs roaming. It cuts down their tendency to roaming. Some right away, and others it takes a little bit longer time. But there's almost 90% success rate. If you look at the aggression, intermale aggression, well, it doesn't really work in all cases in 40%. It doesn't work, has no effect, and in the remaining 60%, there is some effect. And knowing that if you have a client whose dog has one of these problems, the fact that you can tell them, instruct the owner or tell the owner that, yeah, there's a 60% chance that it will help, but it may also not work, which happens in 40% of cases. That's really solid knowledge that the owner can then decide, should I spend the money to have my dog castrated, or is it not worth it? And I think that's when we look ahead of what we are doing, I think that we should all think about this. When we try to introduce something new, whether it's the Paul's green thing, what do you call it, the measure you put under what? Das table gauge. Okay. Does it work? Is it being used? Etc. We should know much more about that. Just an example now. We should know that to much better extent. So that would be my suggestion to the future of ISES. Oh, I almost forgot the most important part. Then also introduce me to downhill skiing. Thank you.
in reality, the contemporary giants are all sitting to my left. My background's quite different. I didn't really get into horses until I was sort of early 20s. And most of this was actually the fault of this woman, so Dr. Mark Cardi Worthington. The word giant's quite good because it's not that she was a particularly large person, but she is particularly larger than life. And I think Paul made the comment that of the slide with Mark and Lucy and the others on, they're not the easiest people to get on with. I lived with Mark for 4 years and taught me an awful lot about life, I think is probably the best way of putting it, and living in very extreme environments. So, okay, I can't actually see my screen, it's so small. It's tiny. Make it bigger. Okay, so really, my big thing that I always said about Mart, I never quite got brave enough to say it to her face, but I would definitely now, is that she was always before her time. She was always ahead of her time. So she was always having an idea when everybody else wasn't quite there yet. And as a result, quite often her ideas were dismissed. And one of my earliest memories of working with her, given I was doing projects and my PhD on cows, not even horses, and I did get taught to ride a cow by Mark, which didn't surprise any of you guys, is that she just was always one of those people that didn't really care what people thought as long as it was doing the animals good. And I used to watch her giving riding lessons on horses, and she was always applying the principles of learning, but just not using any of the words. So it didn't have a special sort of so-and-so's way or whatever. It was just how horses learn. So I don't really have a lot to say. I mean, she's published a lot of books, and the best thing about Mark's books is they're not particularly scientific, but they are equally comfortable in a library as on a coffee table, and I think she's really hit the nail on the head there. She always had loads of pictures in her books, which I think was always a good thing, especially when I subsequently bought one of her horses and the picture was everywhere. She was difficult to work with, and I think if you stuck with it, she could recognise that you were really committed. And one of the really good things about her is if she didn't know something, she would just go and do a degree to find out. And I was with her at the time when she was sort of doing a philosophy doctorate, so she therefore made me read lots of books that I probably never would have read. I think it was in the hope that she could have a nice philosophical conversation with me. I'm not sure I ever quite got that far, but that was partly because she would just sort of turn back into farmer mode in the next sentence and you never quite knew where you were. So, I mean, she really was quite an influential figure. She's not dead, by the way, she just lives in France, but is apparently going back to the UK, because even she thinks she's getting on a bit. I keep saying was, just I haven't seen her for a long time. But I would say that she wasn't exactly a mother figure, in fact, for those of you that know her, far from it. But she has supported a lot of people, including lots of people that have been on ISES Council, have actually enjoyed projects with her, and I think we all know who we are, and thank her for that. One of the reasons I did want to flag her up as a giant, and chose only her, is because I do feel that she deserves the recognition for the work that she did, and I think Paul did it really, really well. I mean, she's still carrying on doing her crazy kind of things, and I don't think that will change too much. So, giant personality, giant her voice, pretty scary. My other half was terrified of her, which is hilarious. And just to sort of end on a more serious point, over 20 years ago she wrote a paper that would be really well placed at this conference today, which was about the careful use of conditional anthropomorphism, and thinking about how animals think and how we can actually manage that. It was a multi-species paper, which multi-species was actually one of her favourite things, including multi-species ballets. Don't ask. Thank God YouTube wasn't around at the time. You're grinning. Yeah, I know. You were the one who had to sit on a cat or a bull. guess she always will be. Unconventional, bonkers, but really kind of new stuff. So,
Thanks, Hayley. I'm one of the people who also, actually it was a wonderful experience, but I think perhaps, like Hayley, I was a little bit young to appreciate it. I was absolutely terrified of her. And subsequently, it's been lovely to actually, get to know her a little bit better. It's actually a shame she's never attended a conference yet. She's had some comment about them, though, I can tell you that. Anyway, last but by no means least, we've got Cami. She's going to give you the last little snippet about her giants.
All right, so when I received the email to ask us to potentially choose who were giants to us in terms of equitation science, it was a bit of a daunting task to try to make that selection, but I tried to think of, all right, who are the people that somewhere along the way really influenced me to go into equitation science, largely before equitation science had really even caught on as a specific field. And at the time, I had no idea who else was going to be seated at this panel, but you're going to see real quickly that who I chose aligns very closely with who's up here right now. One person who is not able to attend, Hillary Clayton, and I've just done these in alphabetical order because it seemed perhaps the most democratic way to go about it. Hillary has been a great friend, and actually, as it turns out, all of these people who I consider my giants have become really good friends over the years. And Hillary came to Michigan State, where I was teaching at that time, and I had already been using her book on the conditioning of sport horses. So she was definitely a giant in my mind when I met her. And as time went on, we talked a lot about equitation science type topics. And she did quite a bit of work with trying to interface biomechanic principles with how they might impact behavioral type issues. So she did a lot of the, if you've seen some of the work with bits and fluoroscopy, she was one of the people that did that work. And she has presented at this conference a few different times. The other thing that was really cool is she helped me co-author a couple papers. And when she came, I was just at the point where I was transitioning from helping our students learn to ride and train Arabian racehorses to moving into a little bit of a safer endeavor, which was dressage. And so Hillary very quickly became my mentor and really helped a lot with what I was able to learn about dressage. Another person is Debbie Goodwin. And so when I went to the meeting, when would that have been? Let's say somewhere right around 2005. We were having a meeting before we had become officially a society, and it was in Milan, Italy. And Debbie was very, very instrumental at kind of taking me under her wing and really bringing me into the fold of equitation science. And again, I knew her name really well, so it was quite awe-inspiring to have this very, very important person like personally talking to me. And as I was wrapping up as a local organizing committee member, she said, Cami, I want to figure out a way to keep you on council. So I'm going to make a position called procedural advisor. So basically, roughly 10 years ago, she was the person that created a position to put me on council, and now I've hung around for a really long time. Jan Ludwig has been extremely active in our International Society for Applied Ethology, and I still view that as the big sister to this society. Our constitution and guidelines were very much guided by ISAE. A lot of times when we get a little bit stuck, we try to think, okay, what would ISAE do, and let's maybe do something a little bit similar. But one of the really important talks that we heard at ISAE, I'm not sure what year that might have been, Jan, but I heard Professor Ludwig talking about this term implementology. And he talked about how it's not good enough to just produce the science. We have to figure out a way to get it implemented out in practice. And I thought that is one of the most brilliant things I've heard in a long time. And again, as I I've had chances over the years to continue to have conversations with Jan. We don't always agree 100%, but he's really great at challenging the way people think about issues. Paul McGreevy was another person that I met and chatted with a lot at the that first meeting in Milan. And I remember at the conference dinner, he said, "Cami," in an only way that Paul can say it, that makes you realize you're about to say yes to something that's going to take a lot of work. He said, "I really think the next conference should be at Michigan State." And again, I was kind of blown away. It's like, little old me, how am I going to do that? But somehow we did, and in 2007, we became an official society. We've continued to work together on a couple projects, and he has a wonderful equine behavior book that I've used in a number of my courses. He and Andrew have a very nice equitation science textbook. If you've not seen it, I think they have it out at the ESI table. A number of the articles that many of us will have referenced, Paul will be one of the authors on. And he's done a really good job to challenge the status quo and kind of push issues and really be an advocate for the horse. Andrew is another person that I had a chance to meet at one of the early meetings before we were officially a society. It was actually a satellite meeting that Mattel van Dierendonk had organized in attachment to one of the ISAE conferences. And you know, very starstruck, I went up and had him sign one of my books there. And after that, we've had a lot of chances to interact over the years. Again, I use a lot of his articles in reference to different classes. And one of the big things has been a mentor in positions on council. Andrew is one of the most patient people I've ever worked with. And even when, you know, sometimes on council, you're dealing with human issues, not just horse issues. And Andrew was always really good at helping me take a step back and really process through. And he was also really good at trying to provide positive reinforcement to council members. He didn't always put it out in those words, but you could figure out that's what was going on. Natalie, who many of you will call Nat, she was actually on my committee for my PhD. So I was working with Professor Eduardo Zanella, who a handful of you have probably met before. He's much more multi-species, but does have a huge passion for the horse. He said, we need to make sure we get a horse specialist on your committee, and they need to come from another country. And he and Natalie had been, I think, in school at the same time, right? During PhD. And so he had suggested Natalie, and that worked out to be a wonderful fit. Her book, that's a review book on the welfare of horses, was one of my real early studies as I was looking into equitation science. And she's one of those people that's really good at keeping it real. And you'll have a chance to probably hear her more during this conference. And again, sometimes when we start to head off in a little different path, she's really good at helping kind of bring council back to a place that maybe is where we need to be headed again. So that is the people that I selected.
That's a bit embarrassing, but thank you very much, Cami. And thank you to all 5 of our giants for giving us their view. Yes, if you could grab the microphone. Yeah, okay. Start whirling around. So this is your chance now. We've got around about just under an hour. These guys have done all the work, but this is their view. They've given you some background of the greats, the behaviourists, the ethologists, and some personal views as well about people who had a massive influence on them. And so we're happy to hear what you have to say as well. And certainly here's the panel. Direct your questions to them or make your comments generally. If you just put your hand up, someone will find you. And if you could just say who you are, that would be really useful. Who would like to start? Don't be shy.
Hello again.
I was wondering, I brought up a couple of little questions.
Where are you?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. What's your name?
Lauren. I was wondering if we could establish something like a young ISES network. Because I noticed, even just during the break, there was quite a few of us got together who would really like to be able to collaborate and get involved in the things, but it's really hard to figure out where to start. If you haven't gone the academic route, you don't have the direct university professors and that you can talk to. If you've just got your local horse instructor, it can be who do they talk to, and as was said earlier, the equitation scientists themselves can be very centralised within their pockets. Is there any thoughts on how we could establish something like that?
So would the panel like to respond? So we might need this microphone up here.
Thank you. I think that's a really excellent idea. You're the next generation and we look to you. And how exciting it is to have the technology on your doorstep, like at your fingertips. My suggestion, for what it's worth, would be to look, I don't have shares in this company, to look at the IPOS rain tension meters. Because if you're coaching and you're training your own horse, then you're gathering data at the same time. And pooling those data and sharing them with scientists who can collaborate with you to address certain questions would be a really exciting model for how practitioners can actually gather and generate data sets. Because data are our friends. We need data, and it's a perfect way of you looking at the implementation of different practices and allowing the data to be subjected to scrutiny. So that there is a growing network of IPOS coaches. People are using IPOS brain tension meters. I think they're only $2,000 each. But it will be the way. I'm sure it'll be the way forward for evidence-based practice. I think at some stage, safety will have to be demonstrated with something like a rain tension meter. Because if you've got a dangerous horse, the first thing you need to do is stop it and get it off it and give it back to the idiot who made you ride. So safety will begin and end with rain tension meters, I think. Anybody else? There is an ISES student rep, so that would be the most obvious conduit through which to create such a network.
So, next question over here. And then we've still got a few comments.
So our current student representative, Jessie Weir, has just wrapped up her PhD, and she's actually not at this conference, but we will be at the AGM electing a new student rep. I believe we have 2 candidates. I think they may both be here. So if you are possibly able to stay to the AGM, that might be a chance to find somebody. And quite often, I'm going to throw Colleen Brady under the bus here too. Colleen, can you raise your hand and wave to everybody?
Throw me under the bus.
Well, only in terms of workload. As the education officer, that may be also a potential. I could see the student rep and the education officer working together to try to create a network of young practitioners and young scientists. But I would also encourage young folks, if you will, don't be afraid to approach the more senior members and the more senior practitioners. We're really not terribly scary people.
Thank you for that. It actually brought on to one of my others. Is there a central equipment share? Is there a potential for a central equipment share? Most of us don't have $2,000 for reins, but we would love to use them. We can't hear you up.
So the question was, is there a central equipment share for the sorts of expensive equipment that Paul thinks is a little bit cheap?
I would tend to say within each country, there's definitely some equipment sharing that takes place. If you're in the U.S. and you need a piece of equipment that I happen to have that somebody else doesn't, assuming we have some similar colleagues, For example, I've sent my heart rate monitors to various people to do working equid studies, and you just sort of take a leap of faith and hope they come back to you in one piece.
Maybe there'd be a way we could set up an application process for that sort of thing to broaden the access.
I mean, it's certainly a great idea, and hopefully various members of council will remember this, so that we might think, we've tried to think of ways that we can make the website more user-friendly and create more interaction, and something on the members-only page, for example, might be a great place to say, hey, I would really like to borrow rain tension meters. Is that possible, Colleen?
Well, I was just going to say, too, the members-only page was partially set up to create a forum for people to collaborate. And so if anybody's not members of that page.
And I should point out, there's a members-only aspect of the website. There's also a members-only ISES Facebook page. And probably either one would work, right?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess the key message from that, from a Giants perspective, is I think the message that's come through loud and clear from all of the speakers, and that's don't be afraid to go and ask people who have the equipment or have the knowledge, because that's the whole point of this, is to share.
Lots of questions. I've got one at the back. Colby Brinkman, Canberra, Australia. I have two things. One is a general thing, another is about the science that we've also heard about giants. The first thing is about the possibility to get into contact and expand into some of the important developing countries. Like we all know about the problems with horse welfare in countries like India and some of the Arab countries, but as they grow more affluent, they're trying to buy more horses and start taking part in sports. And some of the tales I've heard from China, just make me shiver. So, what are the possibilities about extending links and equitation science with some of these countries? That would be my first point. The second question is more, I said, from the science point of view. I love hearing about, training the horse and the correct principles and welfare. But sort of seeing the pictures of the early ethologists, I would like to ask about that thing that we often seem to forget about, and yet people take a lot for granted, and that is the what actually ethologists call instinct. It is the inborn triggered behaviors that the foal has in it when it is born. How would we best take those into account? I know that's probably a long story to answer.
So I'll try to address the first question. I'm hoping over the years that we create more and more of a home for working equid type research and outreach, because basically the working equids in developing parts of the country is over 85% of the horses, donkeys, and mules in the world. So it's always a passionate point for me. I mean, this is great for what we do for the horses in the lucky areas of the world, but there is so much work to be done on a broader scale. Lauren Bisgies and I just came back from Honduras and collected data over a week related, and it really puts a different lens on things. One thing I would say, like in regards to, several years ago I went down to Brazil and worked very closely with some of the working cart horses down there. And then this past year I was asked to go down more from what you're talking about, like the next level. So here's people that actually want to compete, people at riding stables, and they really want to know how to do things better. So I think anybody here that has a link to a place where you can go, maybe to India or Hungary or something like that, especially if somebody can come up with your travel expenses, but you're willing to do your presentation for no cost, that may be a way that we can help, in some of the ways you're speaking about. I don't know if anybody here can address number 2.
You asked about, Kobe, you asked about foals and innate behaviours. I think you're onto a very important topic there. I don't want to steal her thunder, but one of my wonderful PhD students will be talking about a behaviour assessment research questionnaire that can be applied to foals. So the more data we collect using this sort of tool, an online permanent questionnaire that you'll be very excited to hear more about when Kate speaks, will be one way in which we can capture those data and look at how foals change over time and how their behaviour as foals predicts their utility in later life. And this is being done to some extent in formal studies, certainly in the Netherlands, but we ignore foal behaviour at our peril. There are some very interesting lessons to learn, and some of those behaviours can predict safety and performance, so there's a lot of interest there. So look out for the talk on the equine behaviour assessment research questionnaire.
Could I ask a microphone to get to Jana, because she'll be able to comment as well. Please.
Do you hang up? Oh, okay. Yeah.
I couldn't see the one that you were asking a question. There is actually quite a lot of research going on at the moment with foal behaviour and how prenatal effects can also affect how the foal reacts later on, and the experiences that the foal gets early in life, how that affects its reactions, both short term and also long term. So there are some publications coming out on that now, and I think it's actually a developing field and really important as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And just to say as well that with reference to China, you're right, there are big concerns, particularly with the corridor that's going from the north of Hong Kong up into China, particularly for the racing industry. But there is going to be the World Equine Veterinary Conference held in China next year, and they do have a specific theme for practitioners and vets that relates to equine welfare and welfare needs. So there is it's recognised that there's a lack of knowledge about what horses need, and certainly one of the great things about China is once they decide that they're going to do something, they do it, and they bring in people to give them knowledge. It's going to take a long time to sort of build that knowledge, but at least there's a willingness to learn. Question? Where's the next question?
Yes.
Hi there. I'm Jen Davey. I'm a behavioural trainer for dogs, and I'm studying equitation science with Andrew. About 5 years ago, I was lucky enough to meet Andrew. I took my horse from Perth and took him over to Brisbane. As a behavioural trainer, I work closely with a vet behaviourist who has access to behavioural medicines, which on occasions have proved to be incredibly important. I'm aware of lack of anything at the moment, or I haven't got access to anything with medications for horses. And I was particularly aware of it when I wanted to take my horse on a very long journey from Perth to Brisbane, which I think it took in total about 10 days of the horse on transport for 12 hours, off transport for 12 hours. Now with dogs, if you were putting a dog through that level of high levels of, we'll call it stress and discomfort, you would be able to give them appeasing pheromones, for start, synthetic appeasing pheromones. I found something that you can give to horses, but it couldn't get it in this country. So I really wanted to ask you what your feelings were on behavioural medicine for those extremes in the behavioural cases.
As we know, there is an equine appeasing pheromone already in Europe, and it's been still undergoing tests, but it's available in some countries. It's just not available here. I think that's right. I'm not a vet, so I'm a bit cautious in saying that, but I'm pretty sure it's not available here. And the results, the initial results, I was a little bit sceptical of it, only because it was being marketed by the people who would profit from it and were saying they had all sorts of amazing results. But now there's more evidence from it, I think from Netherlands when I was there last, So I think these things will come, and they certainly would be an added benefit if they do prove to be efficacious.
I think, well, when I think back to the treatments that we use in the dog clinic for therapy for various behavior problems, it sounds like you're familiar with that too. There is certainly helped to get from using medicine, but I think that's an example of how we really have to be careful and monitor the effects, especially the long-term effects, because, well, if you look at the use of Prozac and whatever in human medicine, there's kind of people are getting more and more hesitant to use these things, and for good reasons. And so we have to be very careful in monitoring what's going on. And there also, of course, is the problem of dampening symptoms of pain or something to be able to still compete with the horse or whatever. So and that's being misused in many places, you know. So it's very dangerous waters to get out into. Yeah, that pheromones, okay. Isn't that a placebo effect? Well, it's true. It doesn't matter if you give a pill or cut something away or whatever you do to interfere. It's with all kinds of treatment that we have to be careful.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a question from over this side of the floor.
Hi, my name's Anna. I'm from near Yass in New South Wales. All the giants that were mentioned so far were academics, with the exception of Xenophon. I wondered if the panel would like to comment on some of the practitioners, the trainers in the past, who stood out.
Yeah, well, I did have a small moment as I was thinking about who I would choose, and thinking of certain people that did have a big influence on my training and who I found to be very objective. And the first one was Rainer Klimke, and also because he very much promoted self-carriage, and that's something you don't see much of today. You rarely see riders give with the reins before a test just to check that the horse will stay in its carriage. And he was a very logical kind of trainer. And the next one was Kira Kirkland. I found her to be also very, very objective and open to discussion in many ways. Not in every way, but in many ways. Oh, well, yes. I forgot about Tom Roberts, and I've just written a book about him, but anyway. And of course, and Tom Roberts, I wrote a book with Nicky Stewart about his life and comparing his work, studying his training and comparing it to the 10 ISES principles. And it came out very nicely, and he was also a highly influential person before my competitive life, but just as a general horseman. Most of us in Australia would know of his early books, Horse Control and the Bit, and Horse Control and the Rider, and those ones are, I think, very influential for a lot of people here.
Do you know about the American ones? Ray Hunt and whatever?
Well, I wasn't going to head down the path they're trying to get me to head down. And one of the reasons I didn't bring up this giant in my development is because it was my dad. And I was very, very fortunate to be born to somebody who was raising Arabian horses and training horses of every breed. We never turned away a horse to be trained, regardless of the breed. And he gave me my first pony to train when I was 9, and my first horse to train when I was 12. And even though he had not been trained officially in learning theory, everything he always presented to me, I now realize was practically perfect learning theory. So that would be my practitioner person.
If science begins with an observation and then you create a hypothesis and gather data to test that hypothesis, then observing great practitioners is a wonderful starting place. And for me, when I was growing up, not that I've grown up, watching John Whitaker ride was just a joy, because he has such good hands, and the importance of light contact became clear to me when I compared his riding with someone like H. Simon. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about. Was a very effective ride, but it was ugly to watch. So observations of wonderful practitioners is where a lot of the science came from. So thank you for raising that.
So just before we finish with this, since you asked the question, who's yours? Okay, so another question?
Hi. I just had a comment on the behavioural medication available to horses. There was a recent study done by Sue McDonald on the use of alpha-casozepine. There wasn't much, and there weren't many horses in the study, but there were some promising results in the use of around 2,000 milligrams in her previous study in 2013 on ponies. And this recent study, the 2014 study, was on mature horses with aversive stimuli in the university environment. And there were some promising results, but they didn't have a milligram per kilogram amount. And so possibly erring between 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of alpha-casozepine. And at a recent seminar I was at in Sydney, Vetiquinol is producing Zilkine or alpha-casozepine medication for dogs that goes up to 450 milligrams. So there is potential for that use, but in the situation for floating, it might not be appropriate, and obviously behaviour modification and a long-term plan is preferable. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Another question?
Yeah, and just to another comments about the factor journey on horses. Definitely when you move your horses from Perth to Brisbane or Sydney, there is basically an effect on the immune system. So, and this is the cause of disease. So what you can actually use is an immunomodulator. There is Immunostim, and it was actually available in Australia, and Beerbuck gave. And otherwise, if you don't want to use immunomodulator, you can give some antioxidants, vitamin C, selenium, and vitamin E will help a lot.
There you were, only sitting 2 tables away from each other. Isn't that wonderful? This is what this collaboration and communication is all about. Actually, as someone who's just moved their horses for the 2nd time from one side of the world to the other, and having a great interest in transport, I think it's a really important thing to remember that the short term, which might not feel short term when they're travelling by plane or 10 days on a transporter, the short term stress is one thing, but you also have to think about the long term and what actually happens, and particularly when you're using things like medication and so on. So I think it's sort of a big picture thing. All right, next question.
Okay, sorry, I'm Claudia, I'm from Charles Sturt Uni here, and I've been lucky enough to do my honours project this year with the uni, and it's inside. Anyway, something that's come up this year, because I work in the local pub, is I tell people what I do, and everyone says, oh, crazy horse people. So, if we're here for collaboration and change and communication, how are we going to do that from a grassroots level through legislation if people think we're just crazy horse people?
And I will offer that question to the panel. Cami will start.
Hi. So I think what you're saying, I mean, we're all laughing about it, but there definitely is a perception, if people have known very many horse people, that we are certainly an eccentric bunch, and I don't know that I would dissuade them from that. But I think any time you have an opportunity to have a rational conversation with people, you need to take that opportunity. And you're going to hear me talking a little bit later in this conference about racehorses and racehorse industry and racehorse welfare. And I have found that a lot of horse people themselves are very quick to jump on the attack. And I try to give every possible opportunity now to have a rational conversation with people about the issues they're bringing up. So I think it's the job of every single person here, when you have a chance to not act like a crazy horse person, you need to take that opportunity.
Yeah, I think just to sort of build up on that, being the person that's taken on responsibility for the very course that you're talking about, I think we have to work really hard to make sure that our courses, our, as in everybody's courses, actually produce graduates who don't behave in a crazy way because they don't know any better. So, I think there is a kind of global responsibility within education to do that, because we need to produce graduates who actually are helping the industry to change. So, anyone doing any course at any level needs to be future-proof, needs to be ready for where the industry is going, and not for the industry that's, dare I say, gone.
Any other comments?
The reason why gay people think that horse people are crazy is because they are crazy.
So what you're saying is embrace the craziness.
Well, I don't really think horse people are crazy anyway, but I think it's just because the knowledge in the horse industry comes from folklore and tradition and old practice, and there's not a lot of objective science to it. When you hear people giving very traditional lessons, a lot of the terms they use don't make a whole lot of sense. And if it doesn't make sense to people, horses are not rocket scientists either, so it must be difficult. So that's why we're here, is to try and make sense of the world. So of course they might see people, some people label others as crazy, but actually in time, as it becomes a more respected area of pursuit, people will begin to see that there is some, there's a lot of sense and logic to how we interact with horses, and it's also good for people, hippotherapy and all of those things. So I don't see there's anything crazy about it at all. To my mind, the way you start is to, at any level, is just engage with people and then start asking questions and lead them with questions to their own demise, so they really see what you're saying has some sense to it.
Okay, thank you. There's a question.
Yeah, sorry, just to follow up. Sorry, I'm a volunteer, but just to touch on this topic, because it's been rolling around in my head especially since the Melbourne Cup. So often social media is a really good thing, but I find we're having a lot of trial by social media, especially in terms of, we're talking about collecting data. You can use your phone, you can capture pictures and videos. There seems to be fairly selective use of such things, often not for the good. I suppose we're talking about trying to spread more information to people. I find the horse community tends to be less receptive than the layperson, because fundamentally, I guess no one wants to be told that they're wrong. But where do you draw the line in engaging with people and trying to spread information without getting sucked into the rabbit hole of, I guess, aggression that can come from people that are able to express themselves behind a keyboard without the consequence of their nasty words?
That's a very, very important question, and one I think that ISES has been grappling with for quite a while, but I'm going to throw the floor open to the panel first, and then perhaps there'll be some comment as well around the room.
I'll just say one thing, think of Obama's words, when they aim low, you shoot high.
I think it's an excellent question. There is an expression, you can always tell a horse person, but you can't tell a horse person anything. And engaging is the only way forward. The soul of science is discourse, so it's our job to engage. But there's a reasonable platform that I'd like you to have a glance at, and that's the conversation. So that's an online magazine that the content's written by academics, but with journalistic style. So there's journalists editing the material, making sure it reaches the right audience. And to an extent, the comment section in those articles is very civilised. So there's some stimulus material for the learning opportunity. That's the 800-word piece, and then there's a moderated commentary that follows. So it'd be worth having a glance at that, and I'd encourage all of our colleagues to contribute to the conversation, because it's an extremely good platform to give an interpretation of a new scientific discovery, for instance. Thank you.
Just to follow that up a little bit, I'm doing honours here next year, and I suppose one of my biggest fears is that you wade into something like this with the best of intentions to talk to people, and well, what happens if it sort of blows up, and then your name is attached to all the drama that gets associated with it. I suppose it's just a small amount of fear that exists in trying to communicate without it come back negative reflection on you.
Well, for me, that's why the conversation is the right platform. So have a look, yeah. But other people may have other ideas.
I think your point's very valid, and I'm sure people in this room have also experienced similar situations. And so perhaps what would be good is for people here to gather and maybe to have a chat with you, to kind of reassure you that I think if you take a scientific approach, the whole point of science is the pursuit of truth. Our evidence-based approach at least gives you ammunition. It doesn't, you don't fall back into that kind of emotional stuff. You stay quite objective. I don't think it will blow up in your face. I think it's far too powerful. Right, so we've got some more questions and comments. Have you got one here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think it's really important for everybody here to remember that in leadership, there's going to be those steps out into the void. If you're the first starting a civil conversation, it's uncharted territory for all of us, right? But I work with children largely, and I think when you talk about grassroots and communicating some of that, leading by example is really important, especially in the social media forum, and making some of that accessible is also very important. You want to start them young so that the things start to grow, right? And the more that they can access information and people that they can look up to that are doing this kind of thing, the better and the further that's going to propagate into the general direction of where you want to go. So don't be scared of that, please.
We've got a question over here. Thank you very much. Nick.
Nick de Brouwer from Red Wings Horse Sanctuary in the UK. Just picking up the social media point, I think actually listening to the talks on Saturday might be a really useful insight into engaging on social media. You can actually shoot high by actually taking, not just presenting the evidence as to why something may or may not be as bad as it seems in the photo or the video, but actually how you approach that. Some people are very effective at shutting dead the vicious side of a social media debate by aligning everybody's views that they're all in this debate for the welfare of the animal. That's why they started the conversation, and making it more difficult for people to be aggressive when they realise that they're actually meant to be on the same page. And I think some of the speakers, having seen some of the abstracts on Saturday, will probably give us all far more insight into how we can communicate. And that's, I think, why Hayley found it difficult with sorting out the running order, is these three things are so interlinked, because how you communicate requires a knowledge of human behaviour, but you also need to know how to, that communication is important and the different strands of that to achieve the other things. And the related point I wanted to sort of challenge the panel on was, my pet theory is that horsemen of the past may have created equestrian language to create a veil of mystery around what they do, which effective horse trainers could always do quite easily. But by shrouding it in mystery, they could sell a horse for £2,000 more by doing something fairly simple, because the customer had no idea what the language was they talked about. And I don't know that, you know, I've got no evidence for that, but actually that, for me, touches on maybe what the motivations are behind people having horses in the first place, is where we need to go and look for why we see horse people as crazy. Because I think that's probably, there's as many reasons why people have horses. And that makes then the question of, you know, if we're going to challenge this crazy persona, maybe we need to look there.
Comments from the panel. Not only are we crazy, but we also speak in forked tongues. Any comment? I mean, one of the things I suppose you could also say is scientists are guilty of the same thing, shrouding the subject in mysterious language, making it inaccessible, those sorts of things.
So I want to comment on a couple things. I actually think at least a lot of horse people, as we all laugh about being crazy horse people, actually take some pride in that definition. So when we start looking at whether we want outside people to look at us differently, relative to that, we might want to think about maybe not being quite so proud about being crazy horse people. And relative to what Nick was just saying, I think as the theme of this conference is about communication and collaboration, as we talk about social media, how do we deliver messages, how do we handle these conflicts? I mean, a lot of that's not an equitation science issue, that's a global issue in terms of social media, how information is communicated across social media on every topic, but that's where we bring in collaborators there are people that is their entire research focus. Even as specific as science communication, how do we communicate scientific messages in a way that lay people understand? How do we use social media? How do you keep social media from going down some of those really negative paths? That maybe that's where we look for some future collaborators, is with people that are working in those areas that can apply that science to delivering our messages.
Any more questions? I'll try a couple. So we've got one in a lovely yellow outfit.
I think this lady's been holding her hand up.
Oh, right. Wow. So you do yours first.
Denise Ruff from South Australia. We've been discussing the grassroots level of communication, but what I'd like to know is some comment from the panel about what's actually happening in terms of ISES' role and influence on world bodies, particularly the FEI.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. It's actually one we talk about often in corridors. We've talked about it in council meetings. It's been talked about at many conferences. I'll now ask Andrew to just give us his view on where we're at.
I don't know that I can shed a whole lot of light on the FEI. There are all sorts of obstacles in the way there, because that's the bastion of that tradition that they try to uphold, and the stakeholders try to uphold the current practices too. So I'm not sure that that's always the place to even bother to try and knock down. I think if you get to more grassroots level, but with high level riders as well, but I mean grassroots level in terms of federations, and that's been my approach, is to work with federations in Europe and Canada and Australia to make change. And I'm on the board of Pony Club Australia, not because I want to, it's the last thing I need to do really. It's a very onerous task, as I found out. But there are so many ways of changing people's views, and I think if you start with children, that's a great start. And actually also reminds me of the point someone made earlier about China, is that I can't really talk about it too much now with Australian Pony Club, except to say that the syllabus is under massive review now, and it's going to include learning theory and ethology and best practice management as well. But I'm not allowed to talk about it, so I can't say more than that. I've probably said too much. But China is actually under Pony Club Australia. And few people realise that, but we have an agreement now that's 2 years old, and so we have 15 pony clubs in China. When we had a Chinese delegation over, I asked them what are the future numbers of riders in China, and they told me that a French study suggested that in 10 years there could be up to 50 million riders in junior riders. So if we can make those changes to the Pony Club syllabus, which will be translated into Chinese, that's a way. So there are so many ways of just doing things and getting out there. Also with RDA and all the elements of equestrianism. So I'm really much more optimistic than I ever was that we can make change, and that teaching at federation level, teaching coaches, saying our bit, and in turn, and remaining really valid. And for example, when we are targets of social media, and probably no one's been more of a target than I have over the years, and or maybe Paul. But I've certainly been under the spotlight of in the bullseye for a long time about many things, and I think the way to deal with that when it comes up on social media, either don't engage with it and don't have an account. But if you do engage in that way, then definitely shoot high and don't shout, don't swear, don't stay really objective and just discuss the topic. And no matter how bad it gets, if you stay like that, then I think people will see that in the end you probably have won already.
I think the question of engaging with the eyes is a fascinating one. It behoves us to think about why there is resistance to scientific information and news. And an example would be, guess what, the noseband issue. Because I sent the FEI one of Das taper gauges before it was even considered by council. So I wanted to engage with them. They have yet to acknowledge the receipt of that device. But it's very interesting that over the last month we've seen an FEI vet talking about data on 700 plus horses in Denmark. So things are beginning to change. But just if we take the step of asking why they might resist change, they are engaging with elite riders who in dressage may have taken 5 or 6 years to campaign a horse up to Grand Prix level. To change the gear on those horses means to threaten the fundament on which that sport is currently showcased. That's why it's difficult, because if you ride a horse a certain way for 5 or 6 years and then all of a sudden the rules change, then it can fall like a house of cards. So I've learned to understand where the resistance comes from, and I think Andrew's absolutely right that the job he is doing with Pony Club, I think, will be a complete game changer, and he's been very modest about his role, but I think that the involvement of grassroots ways of riding horses more effectively and more humanely are going to change everything. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Right, next question. We've got about time for maybe one more after this. I know you've got lots of questions to ask, but you'll have to have lunch as well.
Okay, so very quickly the social media comment. One thing that I found useful was recommendation from Gary Vaynerchuk, which was when you're young, passionate about something, like don't necessarily have so much wind behind your sails like these guys up here to maybe stand up and say this is what is just to lead with this is what I think and this is what I've found and reference the article, the person, whatever. So you kind of, I think it engages in a conversation with a little bit more I'm right, like a little bit, less I'm right and I know, and more of a conversation, and takes the heat away from you when you're referencing to somebody else who does have potentially more credibility than you, or
that's something that I've found has really changed my bravery, I suppose, to try and interact and educate or try and be part of a conversation, as Andrew says. My real question, though, came from Nat, your comment about Xenophon having good things, but also there's some horrible things in those masters, but it's not widely discussed. And so this comes from a little bit of context. I've just spent 11 months at a stable in Germany that has a lot of trainers coming to it, promoting themselves as representing the masters, like the classical masters, and they're only talking about the good things. And so therefore, so what I'm seeing in my dressage, show jumping, eventing world is a group of people are not looking to science, they're not looking to the here and now, they're going, we've got all these terrible problems and all these ethical problems, we need to look at the people from 100 years ago, and the evidence that they're using is just a nice thing. So does somebody need, or a group of people need to step up and say, yes, there was good things from here, but look at all the crap that comes from that world too, and no one's talking about it.
There's a lot of groups actually talking about that, taking classical principles and holding them up to the ISES principles, and then using those.
Well, I would say probably not in the well, I guess not in the circles that I'm moving in.
Yeah.
I think you're right to highlight that there is cherry picking with the ancient masters. Even that comment about how good it is to have humans in the humans world was Xenophon said, keep your horse in its own waste and deprive him of food and water, and so the flies will irritating, so that your arrival is a good thing. So I think the way people talk about dear old Xenophon needs to be questioned as much as it is celebrated. So thank you. Yeah.
I think in the same way, I think very similarly about the great masters. There's so much we can learn about from what they did do that gave us what we have today, and so many good things. But we also have to remember that in those times, that's when people were performing live experiments on prisoners, and naughty women wore scold's bridle, still bridle over their face to stop if they talked too much. So it wasn't always it certainly wasn't a time of great welfare, so I can't see that if it wasn't such great welfare for humans, it probably wasn't such great welfare for horses either, and I don't think that would have been foremost in their thoughts. So we definitely shouldn't be referring them back thinking that it was a golden age of welfare.
We have two more questions before we break. So we've got one over here, and then we've got one over here.
Hi, I'm Jenny Carroll from Sydney. Nat, you mentioned that there's a psychologist here to help us with some of this. Is this the appropriate time to ask for a response, or is that more, is she going to talk on Sunday? Because I think talking about the appropriate language to use, the tactics of presenting this information is critical to receptiveness.
So she's here, Rachel's here, and she's recording as much as she can, I think, as we go along, and we'll then do some analysis around that, and then we'll put that together with the other information that we've got. And we'll try and show something at the end of the conference, just to show you what came out of this. So I think the bigger piece will be later. Thanks for your question. One more at the back.
This is just a comment about discussing equitation science and science in general with people who deem horse people crazy or don't understand. One thing that stuck with me from ages ago in psychology first year is that people, for what they value, they are constantly looking for evidence to fit their value and belief. And I think that's something that we forget a little bit because we're focusing so much on the horse that we forget that there's also psychology of the people involved. And as what Paul said,
when you're dealing with high-level riders that have, you know, given up a lot in their life for the last however many years to get to that point, and then for somebody to say you need to change your gear is quite a big thing, and of course we hit resistance. And I really liked what Jan said about not only just having the evidence on paper, but also providing proof in what you are wanting to implement change in. So I think it's really important that we look at in a big picture and really work from the grassroots and from the people who are open to change. And those who aren't, I guess all you can do is appeal to any sense of reason or logic, and yeah, hope that they begin to see change happening around them, and then start to want to change themselves. Because I think it's been proved a lot that providing, you know, if somebody doesn't want to change, no matter what you tell them, you're just going to hit a brick wall.
That's a very nice sum up, really. Thank you very much. And so I'd just like to say thank you all very, very much. I hope that out of all of this question and discussion, some of it giant related, some of it comment, that it's brought us closer together in terms of communication. And I think already people are starting to sort of see others that they could go and communicate with, and perhaps discuss something that's of common interest to you both, or to you all. I would like to thank very much the panellists, our speakers here, because I think that they've provoked some good discussion, given us lots of things to think about, shared with us some of their opinion as well, which I think is excellent, and certainly our true giants. So thank you very much, panel members, and thank you very much. So I believe now it is lunch. But first,
we, being not me, Cammy, thought it would be a really good opportunity if anybody who's on the council of ISES could stand up and perhaps introduce themselves so everybody knows who they are. So do we have ISES council members?